Greetings all and welcome to Philosophy Week 2. This week's on an introduction to metaphysics. Firstly, I should mention that this is an introduction into the field of metaphysics and what exists in the world. At this stage, we don't necessarily need to be clear on our own philosophy at all. Much of the activities in week 2 are about initially trying to see the problem at hand more so than finding out the solutions. So one of the main activities this week is the category of being. Categories of being activity, and throughout the week we come back to this again and again to try and analyze things of the world, their general nature, whether we can classify and categorize them into general beings, whether they exist in time, in space, and we're introduced to this term ontological dependence or independence. So in this video I'm just going to give a bit of a quick overview of some of the key concepts in week 2 that might help you to think about these concepts. But again, let me reiterate, at this stage it's an introduction to the materials, so your responses, it's quite important to realize that your responses might change throughout the course of the weeks, the course of the year. At the moment it's about doing as best you can, putting down as best you can your thoughts in regards to classification of things in the world and in time, in space, those types of things. So it's not going to be a final absolute conclusion on things that exist in the world at this moment. The main thing is to set them down as best you can and have a little bit of a go. So what you're doing really now is something that your philosophers often do. They're looking at what exists in the world, but not only philosophers do this. So physicists often ask exactly the same questions, or also theologians ask similar questions. What actually exists in this thing called the world that we exist in? In the study of ontology, they often focus on 3 important questions. One is, what are the fundamental parts of the world? And in your category of being table, that one of those columns really orientates you to think about what are the fundamental parts of the world, what are the most specific natural kind of something, and what category can they fit into. The other question that the study of philosophers in ontology or metaphysics like to consider is, how are the parts of the world, how are the things that exist in the world, how are they related to each other? And for this question you're looking at the very last column. How are they related to each other? Are they dependent or independent on other things existing in order for them to exist? And the other question, I guess, that relates to this field is, are physical parts more real than immaterial concepts? And in the coming weeks we'll be introduced even more to ideas that there are basically immaterial concepts in the world, ideas, and we'll contrast that with other theories that basically the world is full of physical stuff, made up entirely of physical stuff. So we'll come back to those questions later, but initially we're just trying to, I guess, jump in the deep end and actually do some philosophy. Rather than looking at what other people have thought in history, we're actually doing philosophy and completing this categories of being table. And so from this you can start to formulate your own hunches and speculations about on these questions, on the study of existence itself. So it's actually a really fun and challenging, of course, but also fun and playful type of endeavor. So I'm going to talk just a little bit briefly about my table that I've constructed, and I was going to try and focus on this very last column, ontological dependence and independence, because that's a bit of a doozy. And what you're really doing there is some high-level philosophy in understanding these concepts and applying these concepts to your own tables. So we don't, it's going to take a bit of practice to understand these concepts. Maybe do a bit of Google search yourself, see if you can find out some more information on these concepts. Ultimately, it's a extending type of consideration on ontological dependence and independence. It's an extension activity. If you can do that and get some sense of those concepts and how they might apply, that's good. It's not essential for this week also. So the concept that I'm going to focus on is the occupation of a teacher. So I'll just quickly, here's some definitions on what ontological dependence is and ontological independence is. So in a nutshell, ontological dependence is when it is logically possible to imagine X existing without Y existing. And it's basically the opposite for ontological independence. It is not logically impossible to imagine X existing without Y existing. So that's in a nutshell what ontological dependence and independence are. And the example I'm going to use is a teacher, or the occupation of teaching. And in my table, I thought that this was actually something that is dependent. It's ontologically dependent. So the concept of the occupation of teaching is dependent. So I think that it's logically possible to imagine X existing. That should really be not. Okay, let's flip those around. Sorry, my mistake. Ontologically dependent, it is not logically impossible to imagine X existing without Y existing. So I have my X, which is the occupation of teaching, and I don't think this concept is logically possible to think about with other concepts also existing. I need, for instance, the concept of school or also students in order to make sense of this concept, the occupation of teacher. And here's Mr. K from South Park, if anyone is a South Park fan. So in my categories of being table, one of my rows was the occupation of teacher. For its ontological dependence or independence, I actually thought that it's ontologically dependent. And the reason for that is it's not logically possible to think of the profession of teaching as existing without also schools and students also existing. So for that reason, the concept of teaching is ontologically dependent. That's my reasons for that. So as I mentioned before in the start of this video, this is actually very technical philosophy that we're doing here. So, and this is a bit of an extension task as well. It's the very last column. So no need to beat yourself up a little bit about this. Have a few goes, play around with it. The main area of possible difficulties is understanding how ontological dependence is distinguished from causal dependence. In the case of causal dependence, I'm thinking about the things that cause something to be, and often we can confuse the two. So when I think of causally dependent, A good example that comes to mind is, for instance, myself and my relationship to my parents. I'm causally dependent on my parents for my own existence. Okay? But I may not necessarily be ontologically dependent upon them, because if my parents do not exist, if, say, for instance, they pass away, I still exist. I still move about in the world. So for that reason, I'm not ontologically dependent on my parents, although I am causally dependent on my parents. As I mentioned, it's a bit of an area that causes some difficulties in doing this activity, but if you bear that in mind and try to focus on this idea of logical possibility in thinking about ontological dependence, then you'll be best able to avoid any confusion between ontological dependence and causal dependence. So I hope that helps with week 2. It's been absolutely delightful to see everyone's responses and engagement with this week 2 activity. I think we're really sharpening our philosophical insights and our philosophical distinctions in making these categories. And this category of being table will be something that you can come back to throughout the whole year, really, and piece together. And it will be interesting actually to see the philosophers that come up in the next couple of weeks, how they might try to fill out a similar table, how they might try to categorize things of the world.